Well, just 2 weeks after all the problems that affected the airline operator Comair, the airline FlySafair's had a small problem as well in one of its aircraft. The plane took off from Gqeberha, was due to fly to Joburg, ended up having to divert to East London because of a problem with the small components, except that it happened twice. The airline also gearing up for the Easter rush next week. Kirby Gordon is the Chief Marketing Officer for FlySafair. He joins us now. Kirby, good afternoon to you. What's happened to your plane? What's wrong with it?
Hi, Stephen, and thanks for the opportunity to chat about this. Yes, absolutely. It was actually an aircraft that left East London and ended up having to divert to Port Elizabeth. So the first time the diversion took place was on the 30th of March. And what had happened was there are small components on the wings called limit switches, which help us show that where parts are moving, to what extent they're within the limits of their operation and not. And these are incredibly sensitive aircraft components, and they do sometimes give false errors. So we had an indication that one of the small components on the wing was out of limits. The aircraft landed in Port Elizabeth at King David Steelman, and the teams there did a reset of the sensor and cycled the part through its motions, and discovered that everything was absolutely operations normal. And that particular flight then continued on to Cape Town without issue. The aircraft then performed another 24 flights over the next few days, again without any issues. And then, strangely enough, on the 5th, we had the same error that showed up again when it was performing actually the same flight number on a later date. And at that point, when they got it to the ground and yet again couldn't actually discover the source of this indication error, we then decided, let's rather swap out that aircraft, given that it was the second time, perform the rest of the flight with a backup aircraft and bring that particular aircraft up to Johannesburg for further inspection. The teams have been working on it from a technical perspective. They have had what we call in aviation a positive finding, which is something that's likely to be causing the error. They've replaced the small component. It did a test flight this morning. Everything's looking hunky-dory from our perspective. So we are just waiting for the finalization on the paperwork in conjunction with the SACAA, and then it should be released back to service.
Okay, I mean, you maintain your own planes, so you don't use SAA Technical, you don't use Lufthansa Technique, you use your own service. You have the capability to sort something like this out.
That's absolutely right, Stephen. So we perform what we call line maintenance, which is the day-to-day stuff, as well as heavy maintenance. Safair has been an authorized maintenance organization, and we've been maintaining Boeing aircraft since the early 1980s.
You're obviously gearing up for Easter. Now, the last two Easters, there were quite tight restrictions. 2020's Easter didn't really happen at all. What kind of Easter are you expecting for your airline next week?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, I think that's been the theme that's sort of perpetuated now through many of the holiday seasons as we've had them. I think the long weekend that we recently had was a prime example of that, where demand was incredibly high, as South Africans have this degree of pent-up demand to try and get away. And so far, the loads ahead of the Easter weekend are looking very strong. So we are expecting a good period.
You're seeing a lot of demand for flights, in other words. More demand than you would have seen in 2019, do you think, or is it too early to say?
I think it's equivalent, Stephen. I think it's equivalent. Look, we're in a fortuitous position in that as an airline, we've actually grown off the back of COVID. So we're operating now about 150% what we did this time in 2019. So obviously for us, in terms of actual numbers and actual bums on seats, it is significantly more. But as an industry, if I look at the demand overall, I think given the capacity that's out there, we're seeing pretty much the same loads.
There's a lot that's changed in the industry. Now, you talk about absolute loads, if I remember correctly. There was a report from the Airports Company South Africa this week suggesting that domestic airline travel was, I think, only at 56% of the level in 2019 or before the pandemic. I mean, that's a massive decrease. It means that we still don't have nearly as many people flying as did before. And you can see it. You go to our Tambo, you'll see some of the shops still closed.
Absolutely. I mean, Stephen, that is the reality from the industry across the board. I mean, you know, it's for us, a flattering statistic is to say that before the pandemic, we had about 24% of the domestic seat capacity on the routes that we operate, and we're now sitting at about 43 to 46. Now, yes, a lot of that is, as I say, due to some positive growth from our own perspective, but we also have to bear in mind that that's also from the actual pie shrinking, so to speak, and we know that there are operators that were once in the market that are no longer there. I think the numbers are a little higher than that 46. We have them sitting around sort of the 53, 54% mark in terms of the domestic seat capacity out there. We've obviously seen a couple of new entrants come in and a couple of other carriers that have been extending their service network, particularly with some larger jets and so on and so forth. But we are at a portion only as an industry of what we were in 2019 for sure.
Kirby, I mean, you're not going to mention Arrival. I'll mention it for you. SAA are not nearly as big as they used to be. Mango, of course, has, well, problems of its own. It's in business rescue. rescue. So all of that, I suppose, has created a gap that you've been able to fill. That's what's happened in the industry, right?
Absolutely, Stephen. I mean, that is the reality. We see a lot of those players are a lot smaller than they were beforehand. Even some of the Comair brands are a little bit smaller than they had been beforehand. So there's definitely been a shift in the market space in terms of where those seats are actually situated and what carriers they're with. I think the reality is, though, that we are bullish about what the future means. I mean, we know what the size of this industry can be. We hope, obviously, for a degree of recovery coming out of a state of emergency as we have now recently. So we're looking forward to some sort of recovery and with a forward notion of what the industry can look like in the future. And you're absolutely right that does open up opportunity. And, you know, we're very excited about that. We have 3 new aircraft that are going to be joining our fleet this year. So we're definitely planning to try and fight that fight.
You're a Chief Marketing Officer for an airline, Kirby. I expect you to be optimistic about the future. And look, we could do with some optimism right now. It would seem to me that there may be pent-up demand for Easter, first family Easter you can have had in the last 2 years. I would imagine the roads to Maria might be very, very busy this next weekend as well. However, your bread and butter is possibly also related to business travel. Now, I don't know if business travel is ever going to be what it was because people, I hate to say this, have got used to virtual meetings despite the fact that they're absolutely awful.
Absolutely, Stephen. Look, I mean, the reality is that I think the need for travel and the circumstances around travel, as with so many things in this world, have certainly changed post-COVID. And I think we are seeing a degree of reduction in corporate travel. I think some of the very large multinational corporations have been relatively slow to try and lift their bans. I do think there is a degree of resilience. I think people have come to realize that on certain levels and in certain instances, face-to-face still does make the difference. And we've also seen the emergence of some new sorts of travel, the so-called semigration, for example, where a number of corporates in Johannesburg have seen individuals post-COVID that have moved down to perhaps quieter lifestyles in the coastal regions, but now still need to make trips up and down in order to spend some time in the office or to come and see clients. So that's a whole new kind of demand pattern that has emerged as a result of one of those changing trends.
It's very interesting to see what's happening because we now, under the current regulations, you're one of those areas where if you go into an airport, if you go into an aeroplane, you still have to wear a face mask all the time. You've been doing that now for about 2 years. Do you think that people have got used to that? I mean, you found you don't have problems with that at this stage. No one ever opposes wearing a face mask.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are instances where people are uncomfortable and we do sometimes have small issues, but they seem to be relatively well handled. I think it's an interesting phenomenon and it's an interesting sort of view in terms of what people's habits are. I think, you know, we in South Africa certainly didn't experience the same levels of kind of, I think, concern and alarm that maybe some of the Asian countries did when it came to the likes of MERS and SARS previously. And yet it was quite interesting to see that, you know, Asian travels, by way of an example, if you were in an international airport, would still actually quite actively wear face masks when traveling. And I suspect from a personal level that we'll probably see a number of South African travelers who, for their own comfort, will continue to do that well into the future, whether it's related to an immediate danger or not.
Kirby Gordon, thank you, Chief Marketing Officer at FlySafair. I appreciate the time.